At that exact moment when everything fell completely apart, I was convinced that I was entirely alone, wrapped in the quiet stillness of the house. I had no idea that my son was watching me, observing my every move, until I finally raised my head and my eyes locked with his unmoving, intense gaze. It caught me completely off guard, shattering my sense of privacy, and his reaction was nothing like what I had anxiously anticipated. The house remained as deathly silent as it always did on these long, empty evenings when James was away on one of his frequent business trips. I stood in the dim light of the kitchen, rhythmically and mindlessly scrubbing dinner dishes under the running water. The only subtle sign of life in the entire building was the faint, occasional sound of my son Alex's footsteps pacing across the floorboards upstairs. This heavy silence had long become a routine part of my daily existence, but over the past few weeks, it had begun to feel unbearable, suffocating me with its weight. I loved my husband. Or, at least, that is what I kept repeating to myself to keep the peace. Yet, a profound sense of loneliness had quietly transformed into my constant companion. It was like an invisible presence lingering in the dark corners of the house, whispering to me in the dead of night that this wasn't just simple solitude, but a deep, aching emptiness. With every passing day, that longing grew more tangible, more overwhelming, and impossible to conquer. "Mom," Alex's voice suddenly cut through the quiet room. I startled, nearly dropping the glass in my hand, and turned around quickly. Standing casually in the kitchen doorway was my 18-year-old son, absently pushing a strand of dark hair out of his eyes. Looking at him, it suddenly hit me just how fast he was growing up, transitioning from a boy into a man right before my eyes. "Sweetheart," I asked, forcing a calm smile as I dried my hands on a damp kitchen towel. "Is everything okay?" "I'm heading over to Ryan's place to study for tomorrow's exam," he explained, adjusting his jacket. "I won't be back too late." "All right, drive carefully," I replied, watching him silently as he grabbed his backpack off the counter and headed for the entrance. Moments later, the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, leaving me completely surrendered to the silence once again. Alone. I let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to drain the remaining energy from my body and glanced at the wall clock. The evening felt like it was stretching into eternity, the suffocating quietness settling over my shoulders like a wet, heavy blanket. Needing something to dull the sharpness of my thoughts, I poured myself a generous glass of red wine and wandered slowly into the dimly lit living room. As I settled onto the soft cushions of the sofa, time seemed to grind to an absolute crawl. Unwanted memories began creeping into my mind, unbidden and sharp. Recollections of warm evenings spent with James back before his demanding career devoured every fraction of his time, before the endless business trips, and before an ocean of emotional distance opened up between us. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing my fingers to my temples to force those painful thoughts away, but the hollow void inside me refused to be ignored. Yet, there was a strange comfort in thinking I was utterly alone. The doors were locked, the curtains were drawn, and no one was there to observe me, judge me, or question my sadness. I was entirely safe in my isolation. Suddenly, the harsh sound of the front door unlocking and swinging open tore through the silence. My body went completely rigid, and my heart hammered violently against my ribs. "No, please, not right now," I thought frantically. "Mom?" Alex's voice resonated through the hallway once more. Panicking, I stood up instantly, grabbing a decorative throw blanket from the armchair and wrapping it tightly around myself as I tried to compose my breath. "I'm heading over to Ryan's place to study for tomorrow's exam," he explained, adjusting his jacket. "I won't be back too late." "All right, drive carefully," I replied, watching him silently as he grabbed his backpack off the counter and headed for the entrance. Moments later, the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, leaving me completely surrendered to the silence once again. Alone. I let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to drain the remaining energy from my body and glanced at the wall clock. The evening felt like it was stretching into eternity, the suffocating quietness settling over my shoulders like a wet, heavy blanket. Needing something to dull the sharpness of my thoughts, I poured myself a generous glass of red wine and wandered slowly into the dimly lit living room. As I settled onto the soft cushions of the sofa, time seemed to grind to an absolute crawl. Unwanted memories began creeping into my mind, unbidden and sharp. Recollections of warm evenings spent with James back before his demanding career devoured every fraction of his time, before the endless business trips, and before an ocean of emotional distance opened up between us. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing my fingers to my temples to force those painful thoughts away, but the hollow void inside me refused to be ignored. Yet, there was a strange comfort in thinking I was utterly alone. The doors were locked, the curtains were drawn, and no one was there to observe me, judge me, or question my sadness. I was entirely safe in my isolation. Suddenly, the harsh sound of the front door unlocking and swinging open tore through the silence. My body went completely rigid, and my heart hammered violently against my ribs. "No, please, not right now," I thought frantically. "Mom?" Alex's voice resonated through the hallway once more. Panicking, I stood up instantly, grabbing a decorative throw blanket from the armchair and wrapping it tightly around myself as I tried to compose my breath. Shaky breath escaped my lips. My pulse was racing wildly, and my mind was a chaotic vortex of conflicting thoughts, trying to process the magnitude of what had just transpired. How was I supposed to look my own son in the eye tomorrow? How could we possibly carry on and pretend that this humiliating moment had never happened? I pressed my cold palms against my burning face, desperately trying to steady my racing thoughts. He didn't actually see anything incriminating, right? Did he? No, he must have turned away too quickly. Yet, the intensity of his gaze burned brightly in my memory. It haunted me, a look loaded with curiosity, deep confusion, and a strange, unsaid emotion that left me feeling stripped of my defenses, exposed, and intensely vulnerable. The remaining hours of the night dragged on with agonizing slowness. I debated whether I should march upstairs, knock on his door, and address the elephant in the room to smooth things over, to offer some rational explanation that would fix the damage. But fear held me back. In the end, I decided to retreat to my bedroom much earlier than usual, hoping that sleep would offer an escape and bring clarity by morning. But sleep never came. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, tossed in a sea of restless anxiety. When morning light finally filtered through the windows, the tension in the house was almost physical, lingering like a dark, invisible fog. I busied myself in the kitchen, frantically chopping vegetables for an omelet, trying to appear normal even though my stomach was tied in knots and I had zero appetite. When Alex finally stepped downstairs, his movements were hesitant and overly cautious, as if he were walking on fragile glass. He intentionally avoided direct eye contact with me, and I found myself doing the exact same. "Good morning," I offered quickly, aiming for a light, breezy tone as I poured him a glass of orange juice and pulled out a chair at the breakfast table. He didn't raise his eyes, but I could clearly see the deep crimson flush creeping up his neck and face, a stark reminder of the unspoken awkwardness lingering between us. I took a deep, steadying breath, deciding to face it head-on. "Listen, about last night," I began cautiously. Alex instantly froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. "Mom, please, let's just not talk about it," he interrupted, his voice carrying a desperate, almost pleading edge. He set the glass down and looked down at his hands. "You're not stupid and neither am I. Dad is gone all the time, and you're always here completely alone." His words struck me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. He saw right through my carefully constructed facade, piercing straight to the raw truth of my existence, and that realization made the situation infinitely more terrifying. I dropped my gaze to the marble countertop, my fingers gripping the edge until my knuckles turned pale. He was far too observant, far too perceptive for his own good. "I just really don't want things to be weird between us," Alex added softly, breaking the tense silence. "Can't we just pretend it never happened and forget about it?" I nodded slowly, forcing myself to swallow the lump forming in my throat, pretending that a person could simply erase a moment like that from memory with a simple agreement. But deep down in my heart, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Alex stood up abruptly, picked up his empty plate, and washed it in the sink. Every single move he made was stiff, practiced, and deeply unnatural. I sat there watching him in silence until he finished and walked into the adjacent living room. He turned on the television and sat down on the couch, but I could tell instantly that his focus wasn't on the screen. His mind was entirely consumed by something else, and I knew with absolute certainty that it revolved around me. I realized then that avoiding the situation would only make it worse. I needed to break the ice. Gathering a basket of unfolded laundry, I walked into the living room, taking a seat at the opposite end of the couch to fold the clothes. The air between us was electric, charged with an invisible force that seemed to pull us closer together despite our efforts to maintain distance. It was subtle, yet overwhelmingly impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, Alex stopped avoiding me altogether. In fact, he began lingering around me far more than he ever had before. He would randomly wander into the kitchen while I was preparing meals, offering to help with chores around the house, something he had never shown the slightest interest in doing before. Every time I looked up, I would catch him staring at me, and those intense, deliberate looks sent a shiver down my spine. But mixed with the fear was another sensation, an unspoken, thrilling emotion that I couldn't bring myself to voice. Late one evening, while I was sitting on the sofa folding the remaining pile of clothes, Alex came over and sat down right beside me. He stared silently at the flickering television screen for a few moments, but his presence was so overpowering that I could barely focus on the towel in my hands. "Do you want some help with that?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, caught off guard. "Since when do you voluntarily offer to do laundry?" I quipped, attempting to inject some light-hearted humor into the air. He simply shrugged his shoulders, looking directly into my eyes. "I just wanted to keep you company. You shouldn't always be alone." A fragile smile formed on my lips as I handed him a stack of pillowcases. We continued working in silence, side by side, but I could constantly feel his gaze lingering on my face, resting on me far longer than a son's gaze ever should. "Is everything okay, Alex?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to mask the sudden flutter in my chest. "Yeah," he answered quickly, snapping his head away, but the deep red blush staining his ears betrayed his calm demeanor. He was hiding something heavy, something that was consuming him from the inside. "Alex, if there's something bothering you or something you feel you need to say, you know you can talk to me, right?" I offered softly. Part of me was terrified of what he might say, but another part, driven by a sudden, dangerous surge of adrenaline, desperately wanted him to cross that line. Playing with fire was terrifying, but in that quiet, lonely house, it felt wildly thrilling. He opened his mouth to speak, struggling to find the right words, visibly fighting an internal battle between restraint and honesty. He was standing on the precipice of confessing the very thoughts that had been occupying both of our minds for days. My stomach tightened in a knot of intense anticipation. "You can tell me anything," I reassured him, my voice dangerously steady. He let out a heavy sigh, running a nervous hand through his thick hair. It's about that night," he finally confessed, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made time stand still. I completely froze, holding my breath in the silence of the room. My thoughts spun out of control, yet a strange sense of readiness washed over me. "Please don't be angry with me," he added hastily, his tone desperate. "I'm not angry," I answered softly, though every nerve in my body was on high alert. His words hung heavily in the space between us, pregnant with dangerous meaning. My heart battered wildly against my ribs, and a sudden wave of frantic anxiety washed over me. In that single moment, I realized that a boundary had been permanently crossed. The innocent dynamic between mother and son was crumbling, and I could see the raw desire and fear warring inside Alex's eyes. I wanted to say something, to establish control, but the words died in my throat. There was no turning back now. "I know this is completely wrong," Alex whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "I know I shouldn't, but I can't stop looking at you differently now." He felt it too, that forbidden, magnetic pull dragging us deeper into uncharted territory. I opened my mouth to respond, to offer some form of motherly guidance or denial, but the words simply wouldn't come. The sheer vulnerability, fear, and raw emotion in his eyes rendered me completely mute. I shouldn't have said any of that, Alex suddenly blurted out, standing up abruptly from the sofa. Just forget it. Forget I said anything. He turned to flee the room, but the sheer panic in his voice triggered an instant reaction in me. Alex, wait. I called out, reaching toward him, but he was already rushing up the stairs, leaving me sitting alone in the heavy silence. My heart was pounding like a sledgehammer, my mind racing at a dangerous speed. He claimed he would forget, but we both knew that was a lie. This was not the end. It was merely the beginning of something unstoppable. Even though he was no longer in the room, the ghost of his intense gaze remained, wrapping around me, making my pulse race and my skin burn with anxiety. I picked up a book from the coffee table, frantically trying to read the words on the page to distract myself, but it was useless. The invisible barrier between us had been completely shattered, and I was terrified of what tomorrow would bring. That night, sleep was entirely impossible. His confession echoed endlessly in the quiet chambers of my mind, terrifying me and enticing me all at once, luring me toward an abyss I knew I should avoid. My emotions were a chaotic storm of guilt, shame, fear, and an overwhelming, dangerous fascination.